August 7, 2008. Tension was at its peak around Tskhinvali, the capital of Georgia's small separatist region, South Ossetia. After weeks of sporadic shelling, the conflict between the Georgian army and South Ossetian separatist forces was about to take a terrifying turn. Georgia's then-president, Mikheil Saakashvili, bypassing the gaze of the world preparing for the Beijing Olympics opening ceremony, took a daring and controversial decision. He ordered the launch of a full-scale military operation on South Ossetia to restore constitutional order. That night, shells from Georgian artillery began to fall like rain on the city of Tskhinvali. Georgian tanks and soldiers began advancing toward the city. Saakashvili perhaps thought this would be a quick and easy operation that would re-establish Georgia's integrity and permanently wipe out Russia's influence inside the country. But what he could not calculate was Russia's reaction. Within hours of the Georgian attack, a massive convoy of tanks and armored vehicles of the Russian Federation as 58th Army began emerging from the Roki Tunnel running beneath the Caucasus Mountains. This was no peacekeeping mission. It was an all-out counteroffensive. For the next 5 days, the world witnessed an unequal and brutal war. Russian warplanes bombed various cities in Georgia, even the outskirts of the capital Tbilisi. Georgia's small and Western-trained army was completely devastated in the face of this monstrous power of Russia. This 5-day war was the first European war of the 21st century. It did not just bloody Georgia's map, rather, it was an unambiguous and brutal declaration of Russia's resurgence on the international stage after the fall of the Soviet Union. But why? Why did such a big war break out over this tiny mountainous region of just 3,900 kilometers located inside Georgia? What historical divisions, ethnic conflicts, and geopolitical calculations made South Ossetia so important to Russia? And how, as a result of this conflict, has South Ossetia today become a Russian military base and effectively a shadow state within Georgia's sovereignty? We will try to find the answers to these complex and explosive questions from start to finish in today's episode. First, let's learn about the complex ethnic map of the Caucasus Mountains and the distinct identity of the Ossetian people. The Caucasus region is a vast mountainous area located at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, which is an extraordinary mix of many races, languages, and cultures. Within this diversity, the Ossetians are a distinct nation. They do not belong to Caucasian ethnic groups like their neighbors, the Georgians, Chechens, or Dagestanis. Ossetians are an Iranian ethnic group, considered to be descendants of the ancient Scythians and Sarmatians. Their language, Ossetian, belongs to the Iranian branch of the Indo-European language family, a distant relative of Persian and Pashto. This distinct linguistic and anthropological identity has historically kept them separate from their Georgian neighbors. Historically, the homeland of the Ossetians extended on both sides of the Caucasus Mountains. The northern part of the main ridge of the mountains was known as North Ossetia, and the southern part was known as South Ossetia. But they never saw themselves as two different nations. They were part of the same Iranistan, or Ossetian nation, geographically divided only by a mountain range. This division took a political form in the 19th century when the Russian Empire conquered the Caucasus region. The Tsarist administration decided to use the Caucasus Mountains as a convenient administrative border. As a result, when Georgia was incorporated into the Russian Empire in 1801, the Ossetian inhabited region south of the mountains became part of the Tbilisi Governorate. On the other hand, the northern part of the mountains remained under direct Russian control. This administrative division was the first step in formally dividing the Ossetian homeland. It created a deep historical wound in the minds of Ossetians and gave birth to the desire for the reunification of North and South Ossetia, which remains a central part of their nationalist consciousness today. During the Tsarist rule, conflicts over land often occurred between Georgian elites and Ossetian peasants, sowing seeds of mistrust and tension between the two communities. The Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union further complicated this situation. The Russian Revolution in 1917 and the subsequent establishment of the Soviet Union redrew the ethnic map of the Caucasus. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Stalin, transformed the Tsar's empire into a new federal structure based on ethnic identity. Their policy was national in form, socialist in content. Under this, various ethnic groups of the Soviet Union were granted their own republic unions, like the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, or SSR, autonomous republics, like the North Ossetian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, or ASSR, or autonomous oblasts, autonomous provinces. As part of this ethnic engineering in 1922, Soviet authorities established the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast within the Georgian SSR, with Tskhinvali as its capital. On one hand, this gave Ossetians some degree of cultural and administrative autonomy, granting rights to run schools in their own language and form local governments. Through this, the Soviets tried to integrate Ossetians within the Georgian SSR. But on the other hand, this arrangement was like a time bomb. It administratively defined the borders of South Ossetia, but under Georgian sovereignty. Most importantly, it institutionalized the division of North and South Ossetia. North Ossetia was given the status of an autonomous republic within the Russian Federation, RSFSR, possessing much more power than the South Ossetian Oblast. This asymmetrical arrangement naturally created a sense of deprivation among South Ossetians. They always wanted to unite with their northern brothers, included in Russia. But under the iron rule of the Soviet Union, such nationalist aspirations were strictly suppressed. In the name of Soviet brotherhood and unity, Georgians and Ossetians lived peacefully side by side for decades. Intermarriage was common among them. Consequently, Tskhinvali turned into a mixed city where Georgians and Ossetians lived together. But this peace was largely artificial and imposed from above. Beneath it, the fire of historical mistrust and nationalist aspirations burned slowly. When the central control of the Soviet Union began to weaken in the late 1980s, due to Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost, or open discussion policy, these suppressed nationalisms began to explode like volcanoes. Anti-Soviet and intense nationalist movements began to take shape in Georgia. At the same time, in South Ossetia, their own nationalist movement, Ataman Nikas, began to strengthen. They started raising demands to secede from Georgia and unite with North Ossetia within Russia. On the verge of the Soviet Union's collapse, these two opposing nationalisms were heading toward an inevitable and bloody conflict. The administrative borders created by the Soviets were then about to turn into real battlefields. The late 1980s was a tumultuous time for the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's reforms had weakened central control so much that nationalist movements became unstoppable in various republics. This wave hit Georgia as well. At this time, Zviad Gamsakhurdia emerged as the main leader of the Georgian nationalist movement, a former Soviet dissident and charismatic speaker. Gamsakhurdia's nationalism was radical and uncompromising. His slogan was, "Georgia for the Georgians." This slogan gained massive popularity among Georgians, but it created deep fear and a sense of alienation among Georgia's minority communities like the Ossetians, Abkhazians, and Azeris. South Ossetians, who were already raising demands to unite with Russia, saw Gamsakhurdia's rise as a direct threat to their existence. In November 1989, South Ossetia voted to secede from the Soviet Georgian SSR and merge with North Ossetia within the Russian Federation. In response, thousands of Georgian nationalists supporting Gamsakhurdia marched towards Tskhinvali. However, Ossetian militias blocked them from entering the city, creating the fear of the first major conflict between these two communities. The situation exploded in December 1990. Under Gamsakhurdia's leadership, Georgia's Supreme Soviet passed a controversial law dissolving the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast. This was a final blow to the political identity of the South Ossetians. In response, in January 1991, Georgian police and the National Guard entered Tskhinvali, marking the beginning of the 1991-92 South Ossetia War. This war was extremely brutal and chaotic. Both sides engaged in horrific crimes like ethnic cleansing. Ossetian militias expelled Georgians from Georgian villages in South Ossetia, and Georgian forces carried out similar atrocities in Ossetian villages. The city of Tskhinvali was besieged by Georgians for months. About 1,000 people were killed in this war, and about 100,000 people, including both Ossetians and Georgians, became refugees. Russia's role in this war was complex. Although Moscow officially claimed to be neutral, the Russian army and Cossack volunteers were often helping Ossetian separatists with weapons and support. Finally, in June 1992, through the mediation of then-Russian President Boris Yeltsin, the Sochi Agreement was signed, and a ceasefire came into effect. According to this agreement, a joint peacekeeping force was deployed, including Russian, Georgian, and Ossetian soldiers. This agreement stopped the bloodshed, but it could not provide a political solution to the conflict. As a result, South Ossetia effectively became separated from Georgia and turned into a self-proclaimed but largely unrecognized republic. With the presence of Russian peacekeepers, the situation seemed outwardly calm, but it created a permanent scar within Georgia's sovereignty. This fragile status quo lasted for the next 16 years, until the arrival of a new and ambitious leader in Georgia brought the situation back to the brink of war. After the 1992 ceasefire, South Ossetia entered a strange limbo. Legally, it was part of Georgia, but in reality, it was a self-governed, crime-ridden, and economically devastated region completely dependent on Russia. The Georgian central government had no control there. The region then turned into a hub for smuggling, arms dealing, and other illegal activities, from which local warlords and even some peacekeepers were profiting. The dramatic change in this deadlock occurred in November 2003 through Georgia's Rose Revolution, Through a bloodless mass uprising, corrupt President Eduard Shevardnadze was ousted, and Mikheil Saakashvili, a young, energetic, and intensely pro-Western leader, came to power. Saakashvili held a law degree from Columbia University in America, and his goal was to turn Georgia into a modern, corruption-free democratic state and lead the country to NATO and European Union membership. For Saakashvili, Georgia's sovereignty and integrity were non-negotiable matters. He set bringing the separatist regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia back under Georgian control as a central goal of his administration. His firm stance gained widespread popularity among Georgians, but it rang a massive alarm bell for Moscow. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia was then trying to emerge from the humiliation of the Soviet Union's collapse and expand its influence on the world stage again. Putin viewed the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He considered the former Soviet republics as their own sphere of influence. Russia saw Georgia's desire to join NATO as a direct threat to its national security. In their eyes, NATO's presence in Georgia meant the arrival of the Western military alliance on Russia's southern border in the Caucasus. Putin was determined to resist this situation at any cost. In this geopolitical chess game, South Ossetia and Abkhazia became powerful trump cards in Russia's hands. Russia began actively using these separatist regions to pressure Georgia and obstruct its path to NATO membership. Russia began extensively granting Russian passports and citizenship to the people of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. By 2008, about 90% of people in South Ossetia had become Russian citizens. Through this, Russia created a legal excuse to intervene in the region, to protect its own citizens living abroad. Alongside this, Russia began supplying vast amounts of financial aid and military equipment to the separatist governments. Russian military advisors were training their forces. Effectively, these regions turned into full-fledged Russian protectorates. Furthermore, the Russian peacekeepers deployed there since 1992 increasingly began acting as protectors of the separatists, rather than a neutral force. The opposing and uncompromising positions of Saakashvili and Putin turned South Ossetia into a center of escalating tension between 2004 and 2008. Incidents like sporadic shelling, shooting down of drones, and assassinations happened regularly. Both sides began preparing for war. While Georgia was taking military training and equipment from America, Russia continued increasing its military presence in South Ossetia through the Roki Tunnel. In the summer of 2008, the situation reached an explosive stage. Only a spark was needed to set the whole powder keg on fire. In the first week of August 2008, tension at the South Ossetia border peaked. The ceasefire completely collapsed due to separatist shelling on Georgian villages and counterattacks by Georgian forces. On the night of August 7th, in an emotional televised speech, Georgian President Mikheil Saakashvili announced a unilateral ceasefire. But just hours later, the situation changed dramatically. That very night, Saakashvili ordered his army to launch a full-scale military operation named Operation Clear Field on South Ossetia. Georgia claimed they took steps in self-defense after receiving intelligence of an imminent Russian attack. On the other hand, Russia claimed Georgia launched an unprovoked and brutal attack on the sleeping city of Tskhinvali. After midnight on August 7th, Georgian Grad rockets and artillery began striking Tskhinvali. Then Georgian tanks and infantry entered the city. Separatist forces and a small group of Russian peacekeepers deployed there tried to build resistance, but could not last against the intensity of the initial Georgian attack. By the morning of August 8th, Georgian forces took control of a large part of Tskhinvali. Saakashvili perhaps thought he could quickly capture the city and establish full control over South Ossetia. But he terribly miscalculated the depth of Russia's preparation and the speed of its reaction. On the morning of August 8th, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev announced a peace enforcement operation. A massive mechanized convoy of Russia's 58th Army, which was already prepared at the North Ossetia border, began entering South Ossetia through the Roki Tunnel. What happened next was a completely unequal war. Georgian forces could not stand before Russia's vast number of tanks, artillery, and troops. Fierce fighting took place in and around Tskhinvali, but within a few days, Georgian soldiers were forced to retreat. Russian forces not only expelled Georgians from South Ossetia, but also entered deep into Georgia's mainland. They captured the strategically important city of Gori, Stalin's birthplace, and the port of Poti, and blocked the main highway leading to Tbilisi. Meanwhile, the Russian Air Force took full control of Georgian airspace. They bombed Georgian military bases, radar stations, airports, and even military factories located on the outskirts of Tbilisi. In the Black Sea, Russia's Black Sea Fleet blockaded the Georgian naval border and sank several small ships of the Georgian Navy. In this war, the Georgian army was completely defeated. 5 days later, on August 12th, through the mediation of then-French President Nicolas Sarkozy, a 6-point ceasefire agreement was signed and Russia stopped its offensive. But by then, Russia had achieved its main objectives. They not only expelled Georgian forces from South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but crippled Georgia's military capability and taught the Saakashvili government a severe lesson. After the 5-day war ended, Russia took a step that shocked the world and changed the geopolitical map of the Caucasus forever. On August 26, 2008, President Dmitry Medvedev officially recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. This recognition was a major violation of international law. Almost all member countries of the United Nations, including the Western world led by America, rejected this recognition and considered South Ossetia an integral part of Georgia. Only a handful of Russia's allies like Nicaragua, Venezuela, Nauru, and Syria supported this recognition. Following this recognition, Russia signed treaties of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with South Ossetia and Abkhazia, under which they gained the right to establish permanent military bases in these regions. Today, about 4,000 Russian troops in South Ossetia and about 4,000 in Abkhazia are permanently deployed. These regions are now among the most militarized zones in the world. In the post-war years, Russia and the separatist authorities of South Ossetia have started a process called borderization. Russian soldiers regularly erect barbed wire fences and observation towers along the administrative boundary line between South Ossetia and Georgia. They often move the border a few hundred meters deep into Georgian territory under the cover of night. This process is called creeping annexation. As a result, many Georgian farmers wake up to see that their agricultural land or orchards have gone overnight to the other side of the border, into another country. Today, South Ossetia is not a recognized independent state, but a shadow state or protectorate completely dependent on Russia. The country's economy has no foundation. About 90% of its budget comes directly from Moscow's subsidies. The main employment for people here is in separatist government jobs or at Russian military bases. The South Ossetian government is completely controlled by Moscow. Russia's security agency, the FSB, controls the security system here, and advisors appointed by Russia make the real decisions from behind the scenes. The population here has drastically declined due to the war. Currently, only 300 to 500 people live here, many of whom are elderly. With no future for the youth, they migrate to Russia in hopes of a better life. Meanwhile, South Ossetian political leaders regularly speak of organizing a referendum to unite with the Russian Federation, which is their ultimate goal. That is, the 2008 war did not bring independence for South Ossetia. Rather, it took it out of Georgian control and brought it under Russia's full control. The South Ossetia conflict is the tragedy of a small nation that has become a pawn in the geopolitical game of great powers. On one side is Georgian nationalism, which wants to keep its Soviet-era borders intact. On the other side is Ossetian nationalism, which wants to unite their divided nation under Russia's umbrella. But Russia has transformed this local conflict into an international crisis. The humiliation of losing its sphere of influence after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fear of NATO's eastward expansion turned Russia into an aggressive and revisionist power. South Ossetia was that red line for Russia, crossing which required sending a clear and bloody message to the West regarding the consequences. This war of 2008 was a prelude to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It was the moment when Russia showed the world that it would not hesitate to violate international law and use military force to protect its interests. Amidst this vast geopolitical game, the ordinary people of South Ossetia have lost their identity, future, and right to peace. They have today turned into a Russian military fortress inside Georgia, a shadow state whose destiny is determined not on the streets of Tsukhinvali, but in the corridors of the Kremlin in Moscow.